Hi everyone, my name is Mark Moikins from Big Mountain Studio. If you're interested in iOS development, then subscribe, click on that bell icon. You'll get notified when I come out with new tutorials. Now, I'm sure you've seen some really cool animations in mobile apps. Who hasn't, right? Have you ever wondered how to easily add some cool animations to your own app? If so, then this video is for you. First, you're going to learn some basic concepts needed for animation, and then we'll apply some of those basic animations. And then you're going to learn some more advanced animation techniques, mainly 3D animations. So keep watching, this is going to be a fun video. All right, before we dive into animations, let's update our tasks here. Now we finished our launch screen. And in this video, we're going to be covering animations, but specifically, we're going to animate that logo that the launch screen transitions into. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at where we left off in the previous video. So we come here, we have that logo in the center, and now we're on our main view controller. So when this main view controller is done loading, we're going to animate this logo out of sight, basically. Okay, so let's get to it. But first, I'm going to teach you some basics about some of the techniques we're going to be using. And the first thing you need to learn is this word affine, because we're going to be using this a lot. And just to let you know, it is pronounced affine, as in a fine day. I used to mess that up, but I've been corrected on it now. So I want to make sure you guys don't make that same mistake. And what this word means is it means it preserves parallel relationships or straight lines. So imagine you have this blue box here, and when it gets changed, the shape itself maintains those straight lines. Or if it gets bigger, it maintains those straight lines. You know, it doesn't get warped. So who cares? What does this even have to do with the animation? Well, hang on, we'll get into it. Okay, now for our second word. So the word affine is important to know and understand because it applies to transformations. And a transformation is basically a change in form or appearance of something, like this star here. It changes colors, changes position, it changes shape and size. So let's combine these two concepts and we'll get affine transformations, which means changing the form or appearance of something while still maintaining straight lines or parallel relationships in that object. So looking at the above stars, these are all examples of affine transformations, except for one. Can you figure out which one is not an affine transformation? If you know which one is not the affine transformation, then leave a comment down below and we'll see if you're right or not. Okay, there are three main types of affine transformations in iOS, and all of them can be animated. So let's explore what they are. These are our affine transformations. Three affine transformations that you can do on any object that subclasses the UI view object, which is pretty much every control that you see on the UI. We can scale, we can rotate, and we can translate these objects. And translation is basically a change of location. Now you might think this isn't much, but you'd be surprised what you can accomplish with just these three affine transformations and the right animation function. Okay, so let's jump into our project, and we're going to combine these principles with animation and see what we can come up with. Okay, here's where we left off on the Trips view controller. We added this image right here, and this is what I want to animate. Now, the idea that I have is I want to rotate this object, make it bigger, and then fade it out at the same time. So it's going to rotate, get bigger, and eventually disappear, within a certain length of time. So we're going to have to code that. So one of the first things I'll need to do is create an outlet for this UI image view. I'm going to come here, I'm going to hold down Option, click on Trips View Controller, and it'll open up the view controller side by side. Then I'm just going to grab this UI image view and drag it down here and create an outlet for it. Okay, now that I have that, I can animate it. So let's create some space for ourselves, and we'll switch over to just the code. And then I'm going to animate it right down here. Okay, in order to kick off animations, we could just use the UI view.animate function. And we have a few different options. Okay, I want to use this option here because one of the things I'm interested in is this delay property. So when the view controller first loads, I want to wait a little bit and then show the animation. Okay, how long should the animation last for? Let's start with 1 second. We'll see how that looks. And for the delay, actually, you know what? Why don't I set it to 0, just so you can see what I'm talking about. The reason why I wanted a little bit of a delay in there. Okay, animation options. That's an array. So let's start off with our array here. And the thing I use this mostly for is for the speed of the animation. Now, animations have different options when it comes to speed. And if you start with the word curve, you can see them all. Curve linear, that gives you this even speed of animation from beginning to end. Curve ease out, well, you can see it in the description there. It begins quickly, and then it slows as it completes. And then ease in is just the opposite. It begins slowly and then speeds up as it progresses. And that's the one I actually want. This curve ease in and out, what that does is it starts slow, speeds up, and then slows down toward the end. That's the default for animations. So in this case, I wanted to specifically change it so it starts off slow and then speeds up. Okay, for animation, I'm just going to hit enter. This is where we'll make our changes. Now, one of the first things I said I wanted to do was I wanted to rotate it, right? So this is where our first affine transform comes into play. Now, I mentioned that every UI view can have affine transforms applied to them. So let's see how that is done. It's with this property right here. Every UI view has a transform property, and this is where you set your affine transforms. Now, there's one more thing I want to bring to your attention is take a look at this. This property is of type CG affine transform. So it's an affine transform, and it's under the core graphics namespace. That's important to know because I'm going to bring it up again later on. Okay, so we have our transform here, and in order to set it, you just say CG affine transform. And then from here, you can create one of your transforms that you want. We want to rotate it, so we would use this one. But you can see the other transforms. You have a scale and you have a translation. And again, translation just repositions the object. Okay, so we want to rotate, and we have to set this rotation angle. Now, this rotation angle is kind of funny because it's not degrees. You would think, oh, I want to rotate it 200 degrees, and you'd set it like that. But that's not what it is. This rotation specifically is in radians, which is another measurement. So for me, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I think better in degrees rather than radians. I'm not too familiar with radians, and I don't know how many radians is 200 degrees. So this is what I usually do. I usually go to Google and try to find out how to set 200 degrees into radians. And there's a lot of different things that you can do here. You can create an extension. I know a lot of people, they've provided me with options to create extensions. But every time I start a new project, I forget where all my extensions are. I should probably put them on GitHub somewhere. So I Google it every time. So let me do that now. And I want the formula, basically. So I'm going to say formula, and here we go, degrees to radians. And this gives me a nice little formula down here. So it looks like what I do is I take how many degrees I want, and then I multiply it by pi divided by 180, and it'll give me 3.4 radians. So I'm going to reproduce this formula in my code, because if I don't, I'll just forget it. I'm going to copy that part. And let's set it up here. You can access pi through double.pi and divide that by 180. And then once we have that, we can just use it right here. Okay, now we still have one more parameter here, and that is the completion. Oh, what is it? You know what? It probably wants a CG float. Yeah. So what I'll do here, I'm going to change it up here instead. There we go. Yeah, that fixes it. Okay, for the completion, there's nothing we want to run after this, so I'm just going to delete that optional parameter there. Okay, so let's run it and just see what it looks like right now. Okay, it loads up. There we go. And it looked like it was kind of fast there. It ran kind of fast. I think maybe it was stuck or something. Let's run it again just to double check it. Yeah, that's better. All right, good. So it rotated, and that looks fine. Now, I also mentioned I want it to fade out too, right? So let's have it fade out. And you can do that with the alpha property. This property is animatable, which means it can be animated. It sounds funny when I say animatable. It sounds like a different word. Okay, I can change the alpha to 0. So let's just see how it looks now. Okay, good. Now what I also want to do is I want to expand it outward. So I want it to get bigger and fade out while it's rotating. Now here's the funny thing about transforms is I already applied one transform to it. So how do I apply another transform? How can I apply two transforms to that property without overriding it? Well, the cool thing about transforms is you can keep adding to them. So what I'm going to do here is I can say dot, and I can concatenate a new transform. Like if I put that transform in its own variable, I can add it here. Or if I start typing in scale, you see I can also add it this way too. And this is what I'm going to use. I'm just going to scale it. Now there's another transform that you can apply, which is the translate, and you can add it this way as well. But we're just going to scale it. And I think what I'll do, actually, let me put this on a new line. There we go. Okay, now there's an X and Y coordinate. What does this mean? Well, you can scale something. You can make it bigger or smaller, vertically or horizontally. So the X controls the horizontal scaling. You can make it wider or more narrow. And the Y coordinate scales vertically. So you can make it taller or shorter. We want to do both. We want to scale them out vertically and horizontally at the same time. So I'm going to assign the same value to each one. And what does this mean? What does a 3 mean? Well, it's kind of like a multiplier. So it's saying, take the image view size, which I believe was 240 by 240, and make it 3 times as big. All right, should we run it and see what it looks like now? Yeah, that looks awesome, right? Okay, good. Now, I like where this is going. And I don't know how this is going to come across in the video. It may look a little bit choppy, because in the simulator, when I see it, it actually looks a little bit choppy. But if you run it on your device, it'll be much smoother. Okay, everything is looking great, but there's one more animation that I want to add to this, and it's a more advanced technique. It's a 3D animation. So let's learn a little bit about 3D animations. Okay, so let's talk about 3D transformations, specifically the 3D coordinate system. Now, you're probably familiar with the X and Y coordinate system. We talked a little bit about that when we were scaling our image. We scaled it on the X-axis and the Y-axis at the same time. But there's also a third axis too, which is the Z-axis. And this is kind of like the axis or the line that comes toward you or further away from you in the 3D space. So we can do a lot of transformations already on these axes using what we already know in core graphics using the CG Affine transform. But there are some transforms that we can't do, and we need to look at other objects that are not in the core graphics namespace, but rather in the core animation namespace. Using core animation objects, we can make 3D rotations. So what we're going to use is the CA transform 3D make rotation object. And that allows us to rotate on the X, the Y, or the Z axis. Well, actually, if we wanted to, we could do all 3 rotations at the same time. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Now, the picture here will give you an idea of what to expect. But let's go into another program that I think will give you an even better idea of these rotations. Okay, we're in a program called Supernova Studio. And if you're not sure what this program is, I did an overview video of it. But basically what it does is it allows you to import design documents and then allows you to edit them. You can add animation, navigation, and you can define components and get a flow going to test it out. And then you can export it into code. But at this point, what I'm interested in is animating this object right here. So I set up this little example here so I can show you guys what the different animations do. I think this is a more visual and better way for you guys to understand these rotations on the different axes. You can actually see a little preview of what it looks like. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add an animation to it. And you can see the different rotation options we have here. So we can rotate on the X-axis, the Y, or the Z. So I want to rotate on the X-axis. But you notice when I play this, there's no rotation happening. It's because I didn't really define how I wanted it to be rotated. So if I just click on that rotate X, and I can just add a property here. So how much do I want to rotate it? And the thing that's cool about this program is the number you enter in is actually the number of degrees. So say I want to rotate it 180 degrees. I just type 180. I don't have to figure out the radians. So now I can grab this playhead here, this red line, and move it. And you can see it's rotating on the X-axis. So if you remember that picture from the slide, imagine a line going through the center of it here. And that's what it's rotating on, that X line. All right, cool. So that's the X-axis. So let's add another one here. And we want to rotate it on the Y-axis now. So let's delete the X. And again, I have to give it a value. How much do I want to rotate it by? I'll say 180 degrees. And then let's see what that looks like. So now it's just rotating kind of horizontally, right? Imagine that vertical line going down through the center of it. And it's rotating on that imaginary line there. Okay, now there's another one. Rotate on the Z-axis. So can you imagine what that one's going to look like? Well, while you think about it, I'm going to give it a value here. I'll rotate it 180 degrees. And let's see how it rotates. Yeah, it's just a regular rotation, right? So this is what we achieved with just the regular CG Affine transform. Okay, but what I want to do is I want to rotate it on the y-axis. So let's set up a little example here. We can kind of reproduce the existing animation as it stands. So what I'll do is I'll add opacity. And let's get rid of this rotation for now. And I want it to go to 0, right? I want to hide it. I also want to rotate it. So let's add that. And, whether I select rotate on the Z axis or rotate, it'll do the same thing. So it doesn't matter which one I select. And rotate, I think we had it set to 200 degrees. Okay, let's see what that looks like. The opacity, maybe that wasn't the right. Oh, weird. I thought I hit 0 there. Okay. We want to make it invisible. So let's see. Yeah, so it disappears as it rotates. And then we also had to get bigger, right? So let's see. Let's make some extra room here. Add another property. And we scaled it. So I'll just choose this scale right here. And how much bigger did we want to make it? We want to make it 3 times as big. All right, let's take a look at that. So it gets bigger, it disappears. All right, that looks cool. And now for the final transformation, I want to rotate it on the y-axis. And how much do I want to rotate it? Well, let's see. Let's do 200. And let's see what that looks like. So as you can see, it rotates on the y-axis as it flips around. So kind of tricky. You have to kind of imagine that the y-axis is that vertical line, right? But as it's rotating, that vertical line no longer is vertical anymore. So by the time it rotates, it's probably more like horizontal. So it's pretty cool. You can achieve a pretty cool effect by combining these different transforms. And that's what we're going to do in code, but it's a little bit more tricky because these first two right here, this scale and this rotate, that is a CG affine transform, meaning the CG is it's under the core graphics namespace. This rotation on the y-axis, that's not available under core graphics. And if it is, please let me know in the comments below because I haven't found it under core graphics. I've only found it under core animation namespace. Okay, so now you have a better idea of what we're looking for using Supernova Studio. Let's jump into Xcode and reproduce that. We want to rotate on the y-axis. Okay, now if we look at this property right here, I really want to make this clear to you guys. This transform property on UI views uses CG Affine transform. But like I said before, I haven't been able to find anything to rotate on different axes under the core graphics namespace. Instead, I have to do something like this. If we access the layer, now notice the layer is in the core animation namespace. So there's a transform property on the layer, and again, that's under the core animation namespace. So it's a transform 3D. So what do I apply to this layer? Well, first, we're going to back up a little bit. What I'm going to do is create a variable that holds just the 3D rotation on the y-axis. So let me create that variable first. And the way you make that is with a CA transform 3D, but then we want to make a rotation, which is right here. And you can see the different parameters that we have available to us. We're going to supply a float for the angle. And again, that's radians, not degrees. And then we can rotate on the x-axis, the y, or the z. And we're interested in only supplying a value to the y parameter. So the angle, I'm going to use that property that we already have set up called radians, which is 200 degrees. For x, that's just going to be 0. And the y, well, that's our radians variable that we set up. And for the z, that's going to be 0 as well. Hi everyone, this is Future Mark interrupting this video because while I was editing it, I was taking a closer look at this CA Transform 3D Make Rotation function. And I thought to myself, it's really curious, why do I have to supply radians twice? And it didn't make sense to me, it was like that little thing itching in my mind, and I decided to look into it further. I jumped into the Apple documentation, but let's take a look at what it says. there really wasn't much information to go on. And as I started searching through the net and actually going to the second page and third pages of Google, there still wasn't a lot of information. If you read this, it says returns a transform that rotates by angle, which is the parameter name, in radians about the vector x, y, z. And then I look at the types for x, y, and z, and it says CG float, just like the angle, CG float. So for some reason, I got it in my mind that, angle, CG float, and then you supply the angle again for x, y, and z, which didn't make sense to me when I was editing the video. So what does the x, y, and z parameters actually mean? Nobody had a definitive answer, but they did have some answers. And from that, and from additional testing, I was able to find out that the x, y, and z parameters are kind of like Booleans. So I found out that if you supply a 0 to x, y, or z, then that axis is not used in the rotation. And if you supply a non-zero number, then that axis is used. So you can supply a 0.01 and that axis will be used. And you can supply 1,000 or 2,000, some number that's just not zero, and that axis is used. So I thought that was very interesting, and I wanted to share it with you because you will come across documentation that isn't clear. So that's my understanding of this. And if you guys have a better understanding or can provide more information on this, then please let us know. And let me know if my assumptions are correct with the 0 and non-zero. And I think that's why our animation will still work, because I used a non-zero. Even though I use that radians value, it still works. All right, guys, I hope that helps, and I'll let you continue on with this tutorial. Let's make some space for ourselves again. Okay, so there's my rotation. Now, how do I add this rotation to this transform property? Because remember, we already have a transform set on the object. But now we need to add this Y rotation, which is another transform. So we need to add it in addition to what we already have. So what I'm going to do is combine them or concatenate them. I think we saw a property before where I showed you we can use a concatenate on here and add additional transforms. Well, there's something similar that I can do here where I can take that transform and concatenate more transforms on top of it. And that's using a CA transform 3D concatenation function. Yeah, right here. So you just apply it with two different 3D transforms and it'll combine them. So for the first parameter, I'm going to take this existing transform. Now I know from experience, but I haven't read it in documentation, but I'm pretty sure what happens is when we set this transform right here, this property also changes on the layer. So I believe when you set the transform here, it updates this transform property on the layer as well. Okay, so I'm concatenating whatever's existing, like that, with my new 3D transform, which is this one right here. So let's paste that into there. And now we have our three transforms that are all together. Two of them are from CG Affine transform, and the other one is under the core animation namespace, which is a 3D transform. All right, let's run it and see what it looks like. There we go. So that's pretty cool, right? All right, that's it for this video. If you followed along, then good job on creating a pretty cool animation when the app launches. These animation techniques should give you more ideas on things that you can do in your own apps. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Feel free to share it on social media with your friends and teach them some cool animation techniques. If you haven't subscribed already, then do it now because I keep coming out with new videos. If you'd like to help out this channel and this video, you can provide a translation in your own native language so people who speak your language can find this video more easily. All right, thanks guys, and keep climbing that big mountain to be a great developer.